My name's Nicola. I did used to be BT's futurologist. Yes, that is a very silly job title. Even AI thought my job title was silly, to be honest. It's quite obvious that a few years ago, an AI scanned through job title lists and came to my job title and thought, futurologist? That can't be a job. So it stripped out the future bit, and it left me with urologist. So I kid you not, I got on some quite interesting mailing lists that I did not want to be on. And I've just about extracted myself from most of them. So I'm quite relieved. But yeah, I'm no longer officially a futurologist. My job title's a little bit more boring. So I'm a principal innovation partner with BT. I'm part of BT's innovation team. I'm based in Ipswich, which, as some of you will know, is very close to our Adastral Park Research and Innovation headquarters. So my role is really to try and innovate with and for our customers. So I get to work across multiple sectors, both public and private sector, on all sorts of stuff, to be perfectly honest. But I am a slightly weird part of the innovation team. And I mean, you would expect BT to have a lot of very clever technologists, and we do indeed. I'm half a technologist. I'm not sure I'm a clever one, but I'm never terribly sure whether it's the bottom half or the top half that's a technologist. But the rest of me, whichever half it is a psychologist. So I always claim I look at the most disruptive part of innovation, which is, of course, not the technology. It's us. Because unless we embrace it and use it, it's pretty useless. So my role really is to try and understand how customers are changing, how employees are changing, and what does that mean in terms of strategies, and what do we need to think about in the future in terms of the technology that supports a lot of those behaviours. So certainly the customer piece has been an obsession of mine for many, many years, and we've been really lucky actually to work with Cisco on research that we call the autonomous customer. This research spans back quite a number of years. We started it back in 2010. It's panel research, so what we try and do is to take a representative sample across the world of a population. We started off very modestly back in 2010 with 2 countries, 500 customers per country. And as you can see, we kind of got more and more ambitious as we went along. 2019 was kind of our, well, let's celebrate 10 years of doing this, because normally we do it every other year. You probably will remember, I don't know, 2019 seems a very long time ago now, but that was the last year where things were, well, they weren't normal, but, you know, comparatively speaking. Then, oddly enough, we had a pandemic. So we actually did a weird, abnormal version of the autonomous customer back in 2020, just to kind of gauge whether the pandemic had radically changed customers in terms of what their expectations of service were, what their expectation of customer experience was. And now we've reverted back to normality. We've another 2 years, and we published the last piece of autonomous customer research in June this year. And that's primarily what I'm going to talk about today, although actually we've also been tracking back on our, well, 13 years of data now, just to look at, you know, have customers radically changed? What has changed? So I'll largely be talking about the data we just published. Mostly it's the global data. I can take it down to different countries if you want. To be honest, if you have questions, I'm not going to be around for the Q&A, but if you do want deeper dives into any bits of data, I can do it. I have a very large database. So one of the big questions, to be honest, is, well, have customers changed an awful lot? Oddly enough, fundamentally, in terms of their attitudes towards customer experience, in other words, what they expect from companies, largely, they haven't changed. So we get some very, very consistent things that we can track back over the years. The one very consistent thing, which does not particularly amaze me, I guess, as a psychologist, is, frankly, we're relatively lazy as human beings. So one of the things we do not want to do is work particularly hard when engaging with any organisation. So we always get this pattern, and have done consistently over the years, around make it easy for me to do stuff. More on that in a minute, because that's a very consistent trend that we really do need to think about when we're designing customer experiences. We can kind of see there was a bit of a blip in terms of 2020, mid-pandemic, where people were finding things more tiring and exhausting. But I don't know about you. I mean, certainly during lockdowns, everything was tiring and exhausting. So it wasn't surprising that people were finding customer service issues tiring and exhausting as well. To be honest, we really didn't need them at that point. So we got all sorts of very, very consistent things, even things like convenience topping price, although that's usually very economically sensitive. Quite often it does in tough economic times start to tip more in favour of price. As I said, June this year we did this research, so it hasn't tipped yet. So given easy is a really, really, I guess, consistent theme that comes out from this research, we have done a significant amount of work around easy and effort. I don't do my job on my own. It is about research. It is about tapping in to our university partners and certainly our partners generally to try and figure out, what does this all mean? To be honest, I've worked for many years with Moira Clark at Henley Business School. She's probably, from an academic perspective, been looking at effort and easy for a very long time. And she kind of identified that there were 4 elements that we need to think about in terms of creating effortless customer experiences. 3 of those things contribute about 20% of our perception of effort, and the rest of it, the emotional bit, is about 80%. So we know this is an emotional business, it's a human business, which is why we need to think about customers rather than technology first. So let's go through some of these things. Cognitive efforts. Now, this is frankly how much does my brain need to work when I'm doing stuff. That is usually me buying trousers, to be perfectly honest, because there's too many colours. I have no idea what my size is. I don't know what the cut is. It's just very bewildering. So choice is brilliant, but too much choice, we know, our brains are, they're great, but they're somewhat limited. We get a bit of brain freeze. So the lovely thing we can do with technology there is if we can start to personalize those experiences and learn things about the customer, we can start to cut those choices down. Still give choice, but at least give the choices that are more relevant to the customer. That helps in terms of my brain having to work very, very hard. The second one is more obvious. It's things like queuing, time efforts. Time is as much a cost as anything else, to be perfectly honest. So how do we value time? The obvious thing is, obviously, in a shop, we can see a queue. Often if we're in a contact center queue, we're on hold. And queuing's gone digital as well now. So if we're on a chat session, frequently we're still in a queue. The interesting thing psychologically about time is it can be a bit wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey when we're in a queue, because absolute time in a queue isn't necessarily perception of time. We work with a professor at MIT who we nicknamed Professor Q, not because he's an X-Man or a superhero, although he could be. Simply, he studies queues. So one of the things he's observed is you can do things when people are in a queue to distract them for being in a queue. Now, the example I usually use here is if you've been to a Disney park and I ask you, after you've been, how was your day at Disney? You'll be going, oh yeah, we went on this ride and this ride. That was probably about 10% of your visit. 90% of your visit was standing in a queue, and yet they are very good at bending time. It's certainly in the contact center space where I work an awful lot, there are all sorts of things you can do to try and, again, distract people, if it's appropriate to do so. One utilities company, certainly as you dial in, figure out who you are, you go through your identification, it figures out what your birthday is, and also, apparently your musical taste was formed when you were 14. So what it does is go back and figure out what was #1 in the charts when you were 14 and then plays you that #1. Doesn't work for me, oddly enough, because Adam Ant was #1 in the chart when I was 14, and I don't really like him. But anyway, it's kind of an interesting play on what can we do to bend time when we're in a queue, if queues are often inevitable. Physical effort, I love that slide, but that picture, but yeah, that's simply about if it's something I have to do physically, so if I have to go somewhere, how's the parking? If I'm carrying something heavy, how far do I have to carry it? So that's certainly a factor that customers do think about if there is a physical component. But as I said, that's 20% of perception of effort. All of the rest of it is how does this make me feel? And that's really important to try and gauge, and often the bit we forget about, to be perfectly honest. So when we're designing experiences, I keep saying we need to think about all of these things because customers do. And we need to value their time as well as ours. And often in the digital space, we push an awful lot of that effort towards the customer. So we really do need to think about designing effortless experiences and indeed measuring them. Certainly, I was involved with BT's Net Easy score, bit similar to the Net Promoter Score, but slightly more useful, I would suggest, which is all about trying to figure out whether customers are finding things easy or not and trying to remove those frictions. The other thing we found that emerged from the data this year that hadn't emerged before was there are shadow customers in existence. I'm one of them, actually, a customer behind the customer, because we've pushed an awful lot into the digital space, and the pandemic did accelerate that digital space quite considerably, mainly because other options were cut off, certainly during lockdowns. The trouble is, not everyone came along with the journey. I'm a shadow customer because my 85-year-old mother, although she has the capability and means to get online and do stuff, she does not have the confidence to do it. So I am effectively my mum in digital space. It's not just elderly, there are quite a lot of people that do struggle to engage digitally, and they use a shadow customer to basically, if they have no other choices, engage in the digital space. Now, there are a lot of considerations here because I certainly don't have a legal power of attorney. I'm thinking about getting one because a lot of people have gone, you need one. But you know, how are we trying to accommodate these customers? Are we attempting to bring them along with the journey? And how do we make it very, very simple if people don't have the confidence to try and engage them into even considering engaging in the digital journey without necessarily employing a shadow customer, a customer behind the customer? This is a graph. I love a graph, and not everyone does, but this graph makes me very excited because this is UK data. UK has always been a consistent country across all of the years of research. This is UK data, and it's looking at the contact methods that we use over the years. And what we can start to see from this graph is fascinating. So in other words, if we want to contact an organization, what's the channel that we're typically going to contact on? So the first thing to say is, as we've seen earlier, the traditional channels are standing up. So things like the phone, things like email. We actually thought the phone was down and out. It was going on a downward trajectory, and then stuff happened, actually, about 2019. A lot of things shifted into digital. And the trouble with digital space is if things fail in the digital space, we tend to ricochet back onto those traditional channels because they are trusted channels. So we started to see the phone going back up, and it hasn't gone down much. It's gone down and up and down and up, but it's still that #1 channel. And I'll talk about that a little bit more as to why, because that's the interesting bit. Things like chat and messaging have had an interesting journey, I would say. And again, we can see in so we had a peak in 2017 on things like synchronous chats. But again, that experience isn't always great. Synchronous chat, a lot of the feedback we get, particularly if you've got one agent dealing with 7 chats simultaneously, that is not a very natural conversation. That can drop out, you have to start again. So there were a lot of frustrations potentially with those synchronous chats that basically made chat go down. And it's starting to revive again. And again, I'll talk a little bit more around why I'm optimistic about chat in all of its flavors and varieties. We can also see hype cycles. So things like social media. We had whole conferences on social media for service in 2015. It didn't really happen because, frankly, it's a very brave organization that plays absolutely everything out in social media. In fact, it's a classic channel shift channel. Particularly if it's a sensitive issue, you need to pick people up on social media and move them into one-to-one channels, like the phone, like chat, like email. The other comment I would say about this graph is there's no rip and replace here. There's no channel going, right, let's wipe out email, for example. We thought chat might, but it hasn't. The message really is the more channels you put in, the more channels customers use. And that, of course, then makes your life less simple. And I always say with easy goes both ways. It needs to be easy for the customer, but it also needs to be easy for the organization. Because if either party is finding it difficult, it often goes horribly wrong. So strategically, we need to think about what other channels that we can cope with, that we can tie together, that we can make sure that we serve the customer in a way that's easy for us as well as them. Now, the big question, of course, is why? Why do we use those channels? Why is the phone standing up so much? Why is chat frustrating some people? Now, we did a lot of interviews because, again, I'm a psychologist, so I'm less interested in the channels. I'm more interested in why we're doing these things. And to be honest, so are customers. We ask customers about channels, and they're kind of, channels, smannels. We're really obsessed with channels in the business, but they're not. Actually, what ultimately customers have is a goal, and underlying that goal is usually an intention state. It's the emotion bit again. That intention state is usually either positive, negative, or neutral, and that drives behavior very strongly in terms of things like channel choice. So let's start with the lovely customers, the visionaries. They're happy customers, generally. They are doing something they want to do. They have a positive goal. Maybe they're going on holiday. Maybe they're getting married. Maybe they're buying a house. These customers, because they are invested in that goal, are willing to spend a certain amount of time, energy, and effort researching it and making sure this is the right choice for me. In extremes, they are very paranoid. Christmas tends to be one of those paranoid states. You know, I've ordered a whole ton of stuff online. Is it going to get there by the 25th? So we can tip over into a very different type of customer, but largely what we find with visionaries is they are using lots and lots of channels. They get confused, they might tip again, but largely they're not a problematic customer to deal with. If they tip, though, into a negatively motivated customer, we get a very different behavioral state. Of course, they could start in crisis as well. At absolute point of crisis, we start to look at weird hormones buzzing into the brain. That does a few things, to be honest. So stress hormones, firstly, logic goes out of the window. We're not logical when we're angry or frustrated or scared. So that goes out of the window. Strategically for design, short-term memory capacity tends to halve. Now, I used to design IVRs, you know, those lovely press ones for this, press twos for that. I apologize. But generally, when you're designing an IVR, you design it for short-term memory capacity. It is thought that short-term memory capacity is between 7 and 9 bits. So if I'm designing an IVR, generally it's going to be press 1 for that, press 2 for that, press 3 for that. Might get another one in, but let's stick there. That's probably about maximum. When I'm calm on short-term memory capacity, let's chuck in a crisis then. Let's half short-term memory capacity. Press 1 for this, press 2 for. Yeah, I can't remember what 1 was for now. So what the message there is, and of course, you know, I don't design those anymore, but when we're designing any technology for a customer in crisis, it has to be easy. It really does. And that's why channels like the phone do tend to dominate that crisis situation. That's actually why 999, I did quite a lot with the police, that's why 999 tends to get hammered when we have a crisis. And it's great that there are other channels available, and chat is a very easy channel, but we've got to override that. So you probably wouldn't necessarily message someone to say, my house is on fire. You're probably going to ring, because that's what human nature kind of dictates. So we typically get crisis customers. They're much more difficult to deal with. They really need easy stuff if we're going to put automation in front of them. And they do tend to want to talk to somebody, to be perfectly honest. So that's a very different type of customer. That's quite a challenging one. We're not always positive or negative. There's a midpoint. We call it utilitarian. This is transactional stuff. Buying carrots, paying bills. Do I need wow? No, I don't. I just need it to be fast, and I need it to be easy. And to be honest, if we can put technology in there, people like it. As long as it is, of course, quick and easy. Otherwise, they tip back into crisis mode. So what we've done with this is, again, look at customer journeys from a very different perspective. Let's look at the emotional bit. Let's look at how do we dynamically signpost, maybe pop different channels up depending on where customers are in this journey. This does require data about customers as well. So how do we learn about their preferences? How do we start to personalize this? So it's not always easy to do, but certainly thinking slightly differently around that emotional bit can give us a clue as to what channels might work. Now, of course, one crisis behaviour is around fraud. Sadly, again, in the digital space, fraud is very hard to detect. As we all know, it's very easy to be spoofed these days because things look incredibly convincing in the digital space. And of course, if you've had fraud done to you, you do become a customer in crisis. Hence, we get an awful lot of data here basically saying, oh, I want to talk to somebody. I want this sorted out really fast. I want to be prioritised in the queue. So again, it's very difficult to prevent fraud. Certainly in the innovation space, we were looking at potentially biometrics being the magic bullet. You know, my voice is my password, my face is my password. That way I don't have to write all my passwords down because frankly, I'm not going to forget my face, I hope, anyway. But of course, we're now getting AI running up behind us, doing things like voice spoofing. These voice spoofers only need about 30 to 40 seconds of your voice to very accurately spoof your voice sufficiently that it will pass a voice authentication service. So we're kind of running to catch up on a lot of this technology. So biometrics might have been the answer, but it's much more complex. I don't have the answers, by the way. Certainly our security guys in the innovation space are looking very carefully as to how can we combat this. Of course, as I said, the phone tends to be a fairly dominant channel, particularly for those customers in crisis. Of course, the one problem with being in a queue on the phone is that you do get that lovely message, your call is important to us. I never know why I say that in an American accent. But anyway, we've all had that. The thing is, we've all had it, but we don't believe it. And largely, often, the message in the back of our brain is they can't handle their queues. So that's a big problem. So no one believes you when they say there's not enough capacity. And of course, that again is how do we manage that? How do we manage? Because often it's a tsunami that hits us and the phone is a predominant channel. So that's where can we start to become a lot more canny in terms of shifting people onto other channels. Of course, chat, I do think genuinely chat has a lot of growth in it. Now, as I said, there are some problems with synchronous chats. That was the web chat problem that I said earlier about the fact that concurrency sometimes is not great. It might look great on the business case, but it does make for a very stolted conversation. Asynchronous chat, I think, is showing a bit of growth, and WhatsApp being one primary example. And you can actually do a lot more with concurrency. Certainly, we can see 7 to 9 concurrent messages coming into an agent on something like on WhatsApp. It's not quite such a, it's not a real-time conversation. That doesn't give you an excuse to ignore it for an hour, of course, but it's a slightly more smoothed conversation and slightly easier to manage into the contact center. From a customer perspective, they like the record of the conversation. And actually, particularly if you're in crisis, having that record, particularly when you've calmed down to read through, is actually a good thing. So that's why I do think that there's growth in chat. Of course, it's already been mentioned. We have to mention AI. Chat bots tend to dominate in the chat channel as well. We've all hit them, to be perfectly honest, often literally. But the problem, of course, is that because it's very exciting and we've all deployed it, don't get me wrong, there are some really good bots out there, but there are some really terrible ones. And to be honest, they're the ones we, again, remember. So interesting stat coming out saying 70% of customers that have had a bad chatbot experience says it damages the brand. My message here is think very carefully where you deploy the bots. So it needs to be in the right point in the customer journey. It needs to be integrated back into the contact center, because if that bot fails, and they are still fairly dumb, they're getting better conversationalists, but they rely on data to work, and often enterprise data is messy and inconsistent and volatile. So if it hits a block, Don't make the customer start again on another channel. Integrate it into the contact center. Skills-based route it to the right agent with the right skills. Port the conversation across so that from a customer perspective, they don't have to repeat themselves. The agent knows what the customer wants to talk about. So it's a much more seamless and less effortful way of actually interacting. So we need to think very carefully about bots because obviously there are a lot around. And obviously, these are some of the problems that we're seeing. They are pretty dumb. Some of them are just automated FAQs. Certainly with generative AI, I'm seeing some quite interesting stuff. I would also say the problem with generative AI is if it has not got the data, it has a tendency to make stuff up. Now, if you're in a regulated industry, or if you're the police, for example, you do not want your generative AI to make stuff up. So you do need to make sure that it's under control, that it's using consistent data. So I keep saying what we're starting to see in this space actually is people are using the generative AI to do the conversational bit, but they're using much more traditional bounded AI and NLP, natural language processing AI, to actually manage the sensible regulated conversation. So this is, this is going to develop as we get as that. We're not quite at the point where it's acquired intelligence yet, but again, it's kind of all to do with the data in the back end as to how effective it is. But there's loads that we can do with AI that's not about bots. I think the most interesting piece, particularly from an agent perspective, because if we think for a minute about the people in the contact center that are actually handling the contacts, whether that's by phone, whether that's by chat, what we are typically seeing at the moment is the complexity and emotiveness of all that stuff coming in is increasing. In fact, there's an awful lot I'm seeing across sector at the moment on vulnerable customers as well. So there is an acknowledgement from a lot of organizations that, well, either it's those shadow customers who can't deal digitally, or it's vulnerable customers that do have significant complex and emotional needs. The problem is the poor agents don't get the easy stuff anymore. They are getting really complex stuff and really emotive stuff. And often, obviously, they are sometimes not co-located in the contact center with their colleagues because they want a hybrid work. It's very easy in a co-located situation to spin your chair around and go, does anyone know about this? Or you can see tears and give people a hug. So how do we start to use technologies to firstly give agents access to the data that they need and the knowledge that they need to actually answer complex questions? But a lot of what I'm also trying to do is how can we use digital technologies as communities of coping as well, so that the emotional needs of the agents are also looked at because they're important too. Certainly, a lot of the theme of today is about messaging, and my colleague Catherine's going to be talking about some of our smart messaging stuff this afternoon. I think this is an interesting one around going from reactive to proactive in the messaging space. And this I call a me economy because to a certain extent you need to know a little bit about the customer in order to be proactive. So it probably starts with personalization. So let's know a bit about the customer, let's personalize the experience. The next step is, okay, I know about the customer, how do I tell customers stuff that they might want to tell me? There might be incoming demand, but how do I maybe push that demand out? By telling customers things that they need to know on the right channel and at the right time. That, again, requires quite a lot of machine learning. So what is the right channel? What is the right message? And what is the right time? The human analog I would use for this is if you're walking along the road and you're continuously getting tapped on the shoulder going, did you know? After about the 12th time, you're probably going to turn around and punch that person. The digital equivalent to a punch is GDPR, and that will be, okay, you're just getting annoying now. I'm going to turn you off. So we need to be quite careful around this me economy because, again, customers have every right to go, these messages are getting annoying. They're not relevant. They're not on the right channel, and they're certainly not timely. So proactive, we are getting a lot of more, actually, again, customers are saying, if you do that really well, I like you. If you do that really badly, I'm not going to like you. Of course, we could then kick in real algorithms and start to become predictive. So starting to tell customers about stuff that they didn't even know that they wanted to tell you. Now, in this particular scenario, there is a very fine line between a butler and a stalker. If you become a bit stalky, again, customers are going to go, yeah, you're freaking me out now. You ain't going to have my data. Yeah. So again, we need to think very carefully, particularly as we're getting into the Internet of Things, edge compute, when we have a lot more data about customers. How do we use that data in a non-creepy way to actually provide a positive experience? Now, video is one of the weird channels that we've always looked at. And again, working with Cisco, trying to sort of figure out, is video getting a niche? Is it going to become ubiquitous? And certainly one of the big boosts in the pandemic was the video channel. We became much, much more comfortable interacting by video. What we are finding, however, is it's getting a niche. Actually, controversially, today I noticed that there was a study on healthcare and video saying that doctors could miss diagnoses. But my whole thing on this is, well, you actually do get to see a doctor, at least over the video channel, whereas sometimes it takes me about a month to physically get to see my doctor. So there are issues around that. But certainly we are seeing it's getting a niche. That visual component of video is quite compelling. But of course, that's all flat 2D video, and we probably are a bit fed up with that. So we did ask a question, and I always say my innovation credentials would be revoked if I did not talk about AI, and I did not talk about the metaverse. I've talked about AI, tick. Now, the metaverse, which is currently in the trough of disillusionment, it has to be said, but largely customers were quite interested in using some element of metaverse, and whether that's enhanced 3D video or other things, to start to engage with organizations. We are not creating a metaverse in BT. What we are looking at is applications of the baby steps into the metaverse to maybe change the dynamic in terms of service. So we're doing some quite cool stuff. The coolest actually is, I think, well, there's a couple of cool ones. The paramedic in the center there. It's not quite what you call traditional customer service, this one, but it's an intriguing one. So using augmented reality to, he's got a headset on, he's broadcasting live high-definition video using 5G back to a remote clinician who is literally seeing through that paramedic's eyes. But the really fun bit is that clinician has a joystick, and that joystick is nudging a haptic glove that the paramedic is wearing. Now, for those of you who are about to get nightmares about this, which some people have, the paramedic does retain full control of their hands, don't worry. But what happens is the consultant can just nudge their hands so that they can start to do procedures that they would not be able to do unsupervised. So you can start to see that dynamic between a back office person and a front office person starts to become a slightly different dynamic in that sense. So we're doing, I mean, even with things like our engineers, the ability to use things like a customer smartphone to, with the customer's permission, just look at what people have got plugged into their broadband router. And we can use AI to pattern match standard sockets and wires so that we can say, well, actually, you've got the wrong thing plugged in. Saves us sending an engineer out to go, you've got the wrong thing plugged in. So again, we can solve the customer problem far, far faster by using an augmented reality type application. And then because I'm a Star Wars fan, I have to finish on this one because I'm very excited about the next generation of video that we're working with at the moment. It's called volumetric video, and it involves holograms. So I keep saying that my ambition at the moment is to not be standing on this stage physically, but probably standing in my front room in my slippers, but being beamed as a full, realized 3D hologram onto the stage. And obviously, because I am a Star Wars fan, I will have Danish pastries on my ears, and I'll be saying, help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope. I'm very sad, but that is my ambition at the moment. Now, we're looking at applications, certainly for customer service. We've just been talking to an airline, actually, around the fact that if a flight gets cancelled, what tends to happen is everyone runs to the service desk, and all of the airline people tend to hide at that point. So how could we maybe create 3D real-time holograms that actually link back to people that can then talk to customers who are often in crisis? and give them solutions to their problems without actually having to make sure that people are running around physically to be able to actually deal with customers in a face-to-face situation. Who knows? I don't know. We're experimenting with a lot of this stuff. So I've whiffled enough. To be honest, as I said, I'm sadly not going to be able to do Q&A, but I'm going to try and run back after the Q&A whilst you're up having a nice cocktail on the 34th floor. I will be around if you do want to collar me. The research is available as well, so if you're having trouble sleeping, we probably can help supply you with the autonomous customer research. Meanwhile, thank you very much for listening.